Okay, so I think I now have everyone who was in the waiting room. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Spot on time. Always good to see you. Oh, keep admitting. So yes, welcome to this Virtual Innovation Center workshop that is focusing on research collaboration agreement with a great double act between the legal side, led by Rachel Bradley, who is partner at Pennington's Benches Cooper, and the vision from the pharma side. So bit a step further on just the drivers and more rational for putting this type of collaboration together and what's coming beyond the whole legal aspects that Tim will infuse us with his science as the VP Venture Science at Eli Lilly and Company. So very, very simple housekeeping things to start with. So for those who joined at the very beginning, you heard that the meeting is recorded. And so that will be a good opportunity for you to get back to it further or to share with colleagues if interested. Obviously, we're a small group. We think that you are interested in that topic. So Rachel will go through a few slides. Tim will just jump and bring some real life example to that. But if you have any question at any point, feel free to either just pop on camera and ask the question or pop the question in the chat box and we will pick up on that, of course. So that's it for me. And I will leave the floor to Rachel. We'll go through the slides and with Tim to comment on a few points. So Rachel, over to you.
Great, thank you, Elaine. Good afternoon, everyone. Huge welcome to this session on collaboration agreements. So as Elaine mentioned, I'm Rachel Bradley. I'm a partner in the Life Sciences and IP and Commercial team at Pennington's Benches Cooper law firm based in Cambridge. I work a lot with life science companies, and I did spend some of my career before now working as in-house counsel at MedImmune, which gave me great experience. And I will let Tim introduce himself shortly. Just to say thanks very much to One Nucleus for inviting us to talk to you today. And as Elaine mentioned, we're going to go through some key aspects of license and collaboration agreements. The aim is really to talk through some of the key issues and terms that you should be aware of in these agreements, and also the types of negotiation discussions you may have. And obviously, as we're here with Tim, it'd be great for him to give his expert insights from a pharma perspective. And we'll be focusing on biotech to pharma deals only, obviously not academic collaborations, although obviously that could be a good topic for another time. And as Elaine mentioned, this session is interactive, so please do chip in with questions. But Tim, shall I hand it over to you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tim Luca from Eli Lilly, which, if you haven't heard of us, we're a big top 15 pharma company, global, lots of therapeutic areas. I'm a scientist working in corporate business development, so I've probably done about more than 20 deals for Lilly, everything from small partnerships all the way to big billion-dollar deals, and multi-asset in licenses, and these agreements are part of every deal we do. So they're all a little bit different, but working with expert lawyers like Rachel to get both sides happy and hopefully a win-win is what this is all about. So it can be a bit intimidating if you've not been through one of these before, but hopefully we'll take you through it today. And yeah, looking forward to this, and thanks to Aline and One Nucleus for the invitation.
Great, thanks, Tim. Okay, so this is just an idea of what we're going to talk about today. And just to mention that, so the topic is a collaboration agreement, but invariably these collaborative research deals between biotech and pharma are all, well, quite often a precursor for the pharma to then take away the outcomes of the research to go off and commercialize them. So they're often actually a collaboration and license agreement or something similar. So we'll also talk about the kind of commercial aspects of those agreements too. And we'll start initially with some aspects about the points to consider before you actually get into the negotiation, then the terms that you're talking about as well, and then to finish off with some practical points as well. So firstly, why enter collaboration agreements? And again, I'm sure Tim will chip in on this, but it's probably quite obvious, but I thought it might be useful to take a step back and and think about why agreements are entered into, and it does feed into what the agreement looks like and why the parties take the positions they do. So I mean, it's just a short list, but I think it sort of summarizes the broad aims of collaboration agreements. There's always a risk, of course, with sharing information and knowledge that you or your company have developed that you then share with a third party. Of course, one of the main reasons why you would do this is to access funding and another company's expertise. Often, obviously, kind of smaller companies may have the beginnings of something, but not the resources to go off and take the product forward through to trials and actually finally to market. So it's, you know, it may be a great opportunity to be able to do that by entering into a collaboration with pharma company that has, you know, significant know-how and expertise of the marketplace and actually how to commercialize drugs. So it's a great way of being able to get those products starting from small companies onto the market. And of course, there's lots of benefits of pharma as well. You know, obviously it allows them to expand and develop their portfolios into other areas, provides another avenue to increase pipeline with innovative new compounds. So Tim, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I mean, ultimately, we want to be, you know, better than the sum of our parts. You know, there's great innovators outside pharma. We can't discover everything internally, and hopefully, you know, with our expertise in some capabilities and areas together, we hopefully can accelerate and de-risk research all the way through to market. So that's why many of us are in these jobs, to bring in the best innovation to patients, I guess.
Great. So then what makes a good collaboration agreement? And again, maybe some of these points seem obvious, but I think it's useful to just think specifically about, you know, what the kind of principle of the collaboration needs to cover, and then by kind of extension, what the agreement needs to say. So really, for the agreement to work, for this collaboration to kind of work properly, there are these key aspects. So you need to have, you know, a clear scope of research and the research plan. So that helps to lead to achieving the goals that both parties want to achieve. There's a clear budget and clear payment schedule of when payments will be made, when certain milestones are hit, for example, and clear goals for the research, and always by scope, always kind of by reference to, you know, the outcomes that you want to achieve, the targets that you want to achieve. And then the research plan, that's usually a fixed period of time, could be say 2 or 3 years, and there'll often be, you know, an agreed amount of funding to cover that. But also it's useful to think about, you know, there may need to be an extension to the research term. You know, what if further research is required to get the project where it needs to be able to be further developed by the pharma? So that's an option that needs to be covered as well. And ultimately, it needs to be, you know, it's a collaboration. It's not a fee for service. It's where, you know, both parties want kind of a fair agreement that really represents the reality of what they're trying to achieve, and so both parties can benefit from it. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, Rachel and I discussed this before the session, and it's a little bit of a marriage, really. And we want the science to flow, the rewards to flow fairly, but also de-risking to take place, you know, IP positions to be strengthened as things go on. So it's just getting agreement to ensure that all of those kind of flows, you know, happen together. It's easy to over-focus on one and drop the ball on another. So hopefully this agreement will cover all of those aspects, so both sides are happy.
Great, thank you. So I just thought I'd talk about, you know, what normally happens actually before you get into negotiating an agreement. So you know, usually there needs to be discussions, and to do this, confidential information will likely be shared. So there would be a need for a confidentiality agreement. And then if the parties agree that they could benefit from working with each other, usually, and probably recommended, is that they work together to prepare and agree heads of terms. So those are not normally legally binding. The idea is that they are kind of agreed principles but that that's an agreed approach that will be taken forward into the collaboration agreement and will be kind of expanded and developed on in the actual agreement. There are certain times when heads of terms can be, or certain aspects of heads of terms are defined as binding. For example, anything in relation to confidential exchanges, that provision should be binding, but also if it's not already covered by a confidentiality agreement. And also there may be a kind of an exclusivity period for negotiating the collaboration agreement. So sometimes the parties would want that to be kind of legally binding. So they're both committed, both parties are committed to that negotiation period. And they're really a chance, the heads of terms are really a chance for parties to document and clarify the principles that would govern the future collaboration agreement, in particular the financial terms. And it's a great idea to kind of iron out any kind of differences in approach between the parties at that stage, so that you don't get to the collaboration agreement and then have a fundamental difference, and then you've kind of spent even more time negotiating that, whereas you could have resolved it earlier. And usually at the same time of heads of terms, but again, Tim do chip in, but there would be a due diligence undertaken of the biotech's product and its internal research program, and that should be conducted at heads of terms stage, I'm guessing, or before, at least at the point at which, before the collaboration agreement is started to be negotiated. Kind of proper due diligence and in particular on the IP is carried out, so that basically the pharma partner can assess the merits of the collaboration and actually understand the kind of backdrop to the product and how it's got to where it is today, and make sure there's no issues and no kind of inconsistencies, I guess, in terms of the IP, and no issues that they that might make taking the product forward problematic for any reason. And just to say that, yeah, of course, the heads of terms are kind of dictated by both parties' position and bargaining power, but they are important, like I said, and you don't normally get lawyers involved in them, but again, it depends on the deal. But I mean, sometimes lawyers can get involved if there are particular issues, I guess, in terms of issues of contention or kind of understanding the purpose of some of the provisions. But Tim, do say if you have anything else to comment in that stage.
Yeah, I mean, heads of terms or term sheets or letters of intent, there's a few different varieties, but that's a serious undertaking from us. It probably would have been signed off by our head of R&D and our chief financial officer of the company. So we're very serious at that stage. Sometimes we're asked to provide heads of terms before the company will allow us to go into a data room and look at all the diligence. Other times we do that first in order to provide the best heads of terms. It varies a little bit, but the main difference is under the confidential discussions, we probably would have seen summary slides and presentations and maybe a few data requests. But when we get to a full due diligence, a lot of our area experts will go into the data room and look at the statistics, look at the assay performance, look at the underlying details, just to ensure that our conclusions from the top line data hold true. They're not there to renegotiate our interest, they're just there to check out everything's okay. And then the other thing is to look at the way the company functions under corporate diligence to ensure that the right things are in place when we work together, that we can be successful. So it's okay to be honest if there are a few gaps that need filling. Maybe we can fill them as part of the agreement. So it's just really a staged level of detail. But by the time we get to heads of terms, ultimately we want to do the deal. We're not looking for reasons not to. We're checking out that everything's okay to do the deal. And Rachel's right, to iron out some of the key areas in the way we'll work together and some of the rewards at the term sheet stage makes the collaboration agreement a lot more straightforward. So yeah, I think this is a great summary.
So just moving on now to the collaboration agreement. You've past the heads of term stage and due diligence, and now it's into negotiating the agreement. And we're just going to focus on some of those key terms. There are a lot of terms in those agreements. They're quite often lengthy and complex documents, but it's worth bearing in mind that there are some areas which may be difficult to negotiate in them. For example, the pharma partner will have lots of experience in negotiating the deals and have kind of some preferred positions on some clauses. And there'll be a huge, well, there'll be from a pharma perspective, there'll be a deal team involved in kind of negotiating the agreements, even behind the BD lead. So there'll be someone from IP, internal legal counsel, and then probably finance and commercial colleagues involved as well. And yeah, there's some key areas which is worth focusing, I think, on today as those that are kind of most likely to be able to be negotiated and are kind of most likely need to be tailored for the particular deal. And then there are some others which, there's kind of often a standard approach, but we can touch on those as well. So in terms of definitions, just to mention that, some people may see definitions as standard, but they are definitely not in terms of these types of agreements. And, they are different for every project, and it's really important to get them right. Some of the ones listed here are what basically dictates the scope of the actual, of the outcomes of the research collaboration. And then if there's a license to the pharma partner afterwards, then the scope of that license, and then potentially right to receive in terms of future royalty payments. Since basically some of those definitions, such as licensed product, licensed know-how, net sales, are used to define what the product will be licensed and when royalties and other payments will be due. So yeah, key ones are licensed product and licensed know-how, defining the target, and that will obviously be very closely aligned to the research plan and the research collaboration and the outcomes of that research. Some of the others are quite standard and less time needed to be negotiated on them, although they are important. And there's quite often a standard approach to these. For example, net sales is what, the percentage royalty will be based on net sales, which is usually kind of gross income, but less certain exclusions that are quite standard in, and the pharma partner will likely have some standard bits that they would like to see in there. And also the definitions of first commercial sale and valid claim of a patent, and they're relevant for the duration of royalty payments, as quite often the duration of royalties may be due, for example, for the longer of X number of years from first commercial sale or until all the valid claims of the licensed patents have expired. So just to kind of explain the importance of those definitions, really. Equally, FTE, so the number of hours, the number of FTEs under the research collaboration, that might be how the kind of research funding payments are calculated. So it's important to, get that right in terms of what does a full-time employee mean, how many hours per day, how many hours per week, etc. And then milestone definitions, they're important as well, both for the research collaboration, actually clearly defining, especially if research funding kicks in after meeting a certain milestone, important to define those clearly. And then also if there is this kind of onward development licensing piece to the pharma partner after the end of the research collaboration, then if the pharma partner commits to making certain payments on meeting milestones, those need to be really carefully defined. So for example, if there's a milestone due on commencement of a phase 1 study, for example, actually clearly define that's the first dosing of the first patient in the first phase 1 study, etc. So you can see the detail that needs to go into these definitions. Again, Tim, is there anything you want to add?
No, just to be aware that we tend to get a view from our lawyers around what is what we call market, a law firm that's done 1,000 agreements, what's the kind of general spread of like normality in many of these areas. And then inside a big company, we've obviously got internal considerations. Some areas we can be fairly flexible. Other times our lawyers have looked at a particular area in detail and decided this is the way we have to do it, and there's no room for maneuver or very little. So a simple example is the time to make a payment. You can have a principle that you want it as quick as possible, and we're happy with that. But ultimately, our accountancy department can only make a payment within a period of time operationally. So you might want it in 7 days, but if a big company machine can't do anything quicker than 30 or 60 days just because of all the other business they're doing, it may not do you any good to negotiate that. So just be aware that everyone's got their internal constraints, both big and small companies.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Tim. So just moving on now to the IP and license terms, which obviously really important terms in this agreement, which is all based on the IP and developing the IP. So just set out some aspects here now, which are covered in the IP provisions of a collaboration agreement. And it's really all about kind of considering how to treat each party's intellectual property. And so that's the background intellectual property, and then intellectual property in the research outcomes. And the reason IP provisions are so important is, of course, when the companies, when two companies enter into a collaboration together, they want to ensure the IP is clearly defined. It's clear who owns what IP, who owns what. Who owns future IP that's developed under the agreement, and then ensure that it's properly protected by way of patents. And then if licensed, then it's under a clear structure and scope. And usually a key aspect of the negotiation around this will be around who owns the new foreground IP. And so there'll be some discussion around that. And obviously from the biotech company's perspective, they'll have their background IP, and if they improve on that background, then they'll want to own that. From the pharma partner's perspective, they will have seen, so they'll be investing a lot of money in the collaboration phase and also in the onward development of that product, probably post-collaboration. So they'll want to have some secure rights in the IP that's being developed and that comes out of the research collaboration, to basically have kind of that protection over those compounds, which will hopefully go on forward through to trials and then onto market. So there are certain aspects that may dictate ownership. So I mentioned there, if there's a head licensor, for example, if the biotech partner is, derives its IP, say it's a spin out and it derives its IP from a university, then the university may be the head licensor, and the biotech has a license to it. So then there'll be certain restrictions there on what the biotech partner can actually, the rights that the biotech partner can actually grant to the pharma partner. And then just the second piece here is around patent prosecution and maintenance. So I mean, that's very important to determine who does that. And quite frequently that will be the pharma partner, who will ideally want to have control over scope of patent protection in terms of ongoing patents, where to file, what patents to file, and that will be kind of after the research collaboration phase, or even before that, kind of taking over the management of the patent portfolio, but then also paying for that. So there's the benefit there that the pharma partner takes on the cost of those, but then for the pharma partner, they can then have control over what they've kind of invested in. So that's that piece. I'm just going to move on and talk a bit more about the specific IP ownership piece there as well. And typically, and this, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. So you kind of carve out, separate out IP into two different sections. So you've got the background IP, which is really what each party is bringing to the collaboration. It's what each party already owns or has license to it. and what they will use and disclose to the other party during the term of the agreement. And the standard approach would be that in the main that each party will retain ownership of their background IP. So the biotech partner will have its own technology or technology platform or background IP that it will retain. Obviously, aside from potentially the compound, so we could talk about that, but it's kind of establishing that piece, and then the pharma partner will also retain ownership of its own background IP. But there's often a license and could be cross-licensing from both the biotech partner and the pharma partner of its background IP if that's necessary for the collaboration. And that will just depend on the type of collaboration, type of research that's being performed. If there needs to be access to the other party's background IP, then that could be covered in the agreement. And then the foreground IP will be the IP generated or developed under the agreement using the combined background IP and parties' know-how and expertise. And this would cover any IP that's generated by the employees of either party or subcontractors of either party, basically developed on behalf of the party. And yeah, this is likely where most of the negotiation will take place in terms of who owns the new foreground IP. So the biotech partner will want to retain ownership, certainly in elements which contain their background materials and information, and potentially in relation to the compound that they're developing as well, and certainly to any improvements to their background IP. And then from the pharma perspective, it depends on, I suppose, on their input. So there may be a joint IP scenario where there's an agreement that if IP falls into a certain category, that will be jointly owned. But then also the pharma partner might have an expectation to own some or all of the IP arising out of the collaboration. So, I mean, the fairest approach is probably that there's a joint ownership where there's joint inputs, but it may not necessarily be the best solution in practice. So really it's a consideration of what the parties want to use the IP for, what's going to be developed in the future after the research collaboration. And it just needs to be made clear who owns what, and that really is kind of clearly defined and clearly set out in the agreement. And then kind of if there is a license to foreground IP, for example, to the pharma, that would be kind of in a limited, clearly defined in the licensing terms in the agreement. Sorry, forgive me, I think I've just moved slides. There we go, back to where we were. But then I think that, so there's other perspectives that I think, Tim, you might want to draw in there in terms of pharma perspective on IP ownership. So I'll stop there and let you weigh in.
I think generally this is the most complex part of many of these stories around who owns what, who's got the rights to prosecute, who has what kind of license to which part of the IP. I think small companies get worried that this is a way of, a big partner doing a land grab of everything maybe they've got. On our side, we just want to make sure that all of our investment in the project and the outcomes from the project are strongly protected, because obviously the next stages are even more expensive. We maybe would put in hundreds of millions of dollars in clinical development, and so we've also been through late stage litigation on patents, so we have a lot of experience much further downstream that we worry about as well. So in general, I would defer to the expert IP attorneys, and I would strongly recommend that folks get good advice in this section, because there are some general good principles that Rachel's nicely laid out, but it is quite a complicated area, so I won't comment in too many details here, but our IP attorneys are great, and actually often the IP attorneys from the partner are great too, and we often come to good agreements, but it does need to be worked through. We've had big matrices of during the collaboration, after the collaboration, and which components of the IP go to whom and who's responsible and who's paying, and it does need careful handling.
Tim, Rachel, there's a question in the chat box if you'd like to take it now, maybe, because that's relevant. So it's from Jenny from ICR. So I'm seeing an agreement that she does that the company they license to also want to own the data or results, which they treat separately from IP. How do you deal with this?
This is complicated again. So it depends what you mean by own. Does it mean that the company wants a non-exclusive license to be able to do other things with it? Or does it mean that they want to block you from doing further work on, on this particular project once we've licensed it? I would defer to the lawyers here. I understand the question and the concern, but it is on a case-by-case basis quite complicated.
Yeah, and I think it just, depends how you define what the data and results are and whether or not, I mean, if they kind of underpin what the IP is, then it might be quite usual for kind of a similar approach to be taken under the agreement. But again, I think often there's not too much difference between kind of granting someone the way in which you grant someone rights under the agreement. So it may be that the person who creates the results and data, well, they own them, but then, if they grant exclusive rights to a third party to use them, then it's almost similar. So they may retain rights to just use them internally, but it's it's very similar to just assigning those rights. I'm not quite sure, the distinction that you're looking at there, but I think, it's on a case-by-case basis. Hopefully that helps, but we can obviously take that offline.
It's a good indication, at least. I don't know, Jenny, if you wanted to chip in or if you're happy with the answer.
Sorry, yes, thank you. It's helpful. I mean, it's when it comes up in agreements, it's always something that confuses me, because I'm like, we've dealt with the IP and now they're asking to own the data, and we're an academic organization, so it always worries me that what are they trying to prevent us from doing by them owning the data? And I don't quite get how you can own data. It's not patent or anything. So but I get your point that it's case by case, and we need to look at exactly what they want to do with the data. So that's useful. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say there can be IP rights in data. It depends, there could be copyright or database rights. And I think it's more probably about how it can be used. So, hopefully if, it would mean the same to them if you said, well, we want to own rights in that we'll retain ownership in the results and data, but you can use it under this, kind of under the scope of a license, and that dictates how you can use it, but we can still use it ourselves, or you assign the rights in it, but then have a kind of a license back to use it for whatever purposes you need. And if that's on a perpetual royalty-free basis, then that's almost the same as owning it. Just if the principle is important of owning it, then I suppose that's the debate to be had.
Yeah, thank you.
I think also, I think on both sides it's a concern, Jenny, because obviously it's also tied into exclusivity around sort of how long you're committed to us and what are you trying to do with it. What we obviously can't do is spend a lot of money funding and working with a collaborator and then almost engineer that they are free to, make some trivial improvements and sell it to one of our competitors. So I think on both sides, we don't want to block innovation, and the cross-licensing of sort of data that people can work on in the future often gets handled in an amicable way, but obviously you don't want to lose control of your own work totally, and conversely we don't want to lose control of the project either. So there's usually a sort of set of steps that could go through with the license agreements and how they're defined to ensure that both parties are reasonably happy.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just move on now to the next slide. So this is just to set out in a bit more detail about what these licenses to background IP and foreground IP might look like. So it's often, so background IP of the parties normally licensed on a non-exclusive basis, so the owner of the IP can carry on using it. You know, it's not, that's, the royalties aren't associated with that, but it's a non-transferable, so that means it can't be assigned to third parties, can't be sub-licensed, although likely that, for example, a pharma partner might need to sub-license to affiliates. And it's usually, you know, it's limited to the purpose of development, the research being undertaken under the agreement, or potentially for the pharma partner for their future commercialization if they need continued access to the background IP. And then the foreground IP, you know, it's normally, these are the kind of terms that you'll see. So an exclusive royalty-bearing license under the licensed technology. Licensed technology will be the licensed patents and any licensed know-how, likely, which would be the materials or other methods, know-how that are needed to exploit the licensed patents. And then it will the license will usually be defined in scope by reference to territory, so that's often worldwide, but can also carve out certain jurisdictions by reference to a specific field of use. So sometimes that can be very broad, the license granted to the pharma partner to develop and to develop the IP and commercialize it could be in any fields of use, any therapeutic use, but then it also can be defined by reference to a specific therapy area. So it depends again on the negotiation and what, you know, the biotech pharma may see, sorry, the biotech partner may see kind of, there are other fields that could be exploited in other ways, but then the pharma partner may kind of want to have all fields of use to be able to kind of have a broad range of areas in which to develop the project and the product and not be kind of curtailed. So again, that's the point of negotiation. And it would be rights to basically import or export the drugs, manufacture them and sell them. And so this foreground IP will be in relation to the IP developed under the research collaboration. But of course, once that's finished, there's future IP, assuming that the pharma partner takes on the project then and goes on to develop it. So that IP there will, you know, likely be owned by the pharma partner, because that's what they've developed using their own investment and resources to kind of take the product forward. So that's normally the pharma partner that would retain ownership of that. So Tim, unless you had anything else to add?
Only that if it's a single asset or a particular set of claims around a compound, we do find it a bit problematic to split indications with companies, especially for early stage products, because, you know, any data that in a different indication that maybe throws up a safety signal or does that, you know, something unusual happens, could impact, you know, our ability to develop the core indications, although it's tempting to try and split this with different companies or retain some yourself. It can be done, but in general, for early stage uncertain projects, we probably wouldn't do that, just because of development risks. Yeah.
And I suppose that can create more complexities around patent prosecution and maintenance, can't it? If you've got the one patent covering the different therapy areas, and then you've got two partners that are trying to develop products under the one patent but in different indications, that can be quite complicated. I don't know if have you come across that, Tim?
No, I mean, I tend to work in the early stage. I mean, we do hear of you know, commercial rights being given separately to different global areas. Maybe someone sells the China rights to one company and the American rights to a different one, but it's quite unusual in my years to see us carving out one project in multiple different ways at this early stage. It's just we'd see it as a sort of higher risk for our investment in development, which is often, as I say, back to the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in the next stage. So any any of these unusual complexities probably aren't seen very favorably, unfortunately.
So moving on then, so aside from IP, obviously there are other key terms to consider too. So we're just going to move on to those now, conscious of time, but do carry on chipping in with questions if anyone has them. So financial terms here just set out the broad categories of those. So obviously, you know, from the biotech's point of view, they'll want sufficient funds, kind of investment from the pharma partner to basically compensate for the fact that post research collaboration that, you know, there's, well, the pharma partner is getting likely exclusive access to its invention, its product. So it's quite common for there to be upfront payments on signing the deal, although obviously not all the time. And there's usually, you know, a negotiation of when those are made and whether or not there's any ongoing kind of yearly payments. And then research funding, that's, you know, that's often dictated by the duration of the research and how long it lasts. When the research funding is paid, is it on milestones? Again, is that kind of on a yearly basis, regardless of time spent? And then assuming that the pharma partner does go on to develop and commercialize the output of the research, then as I mentioned before, there'll be a commitment to paying when there may be a commitment to paying when certain events occur. And that's, you know, that will all usually be set out in the heads of term stage, kind of what that means. So is it, you know, certain stages, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, is it kind of also there are certain royalty milestones. So once royalties reach a certain point, there may be a milestone payment or not. So those are all to be negotiated, and the royalty payments. And as I mentioned before, the key to getting these, the key is to get these kind of clearly defined by reference to, you know, the licensed product or the royalty paying product definition. And also there will usually be some sort of discussion around any step downs for royalties. So there'll be a percentage usually royalty payable on net sales, but then there may be some step downs. So once all of the patents have expired, if there is some know-how that's been licensed as well, there could be a kind of step down in royalty payments. Sometimes that can be 50% or something like that. There's also some, often in these agreements, you'll see language talking about combination products. So if the compound, for example, that's in question, that's being licensed to the pharma partner, if it's been put in combination with another product of the pharma partner, then actually the royalty is based on the part of the combination product that relates to the originating product from the biotech. So there may be that consideration there. And also if there's a need for the pharma partner to seek third-party licenses, then there may be a step down for royalties due there, and there'll be some, it's quite common industry standard for there to be a step down there as well. Tim, is there anything you want to say on that?
Only at the very top level that every deal is different and every company needs different things from an agreement. But in general, we don't want projects to be engineered to be unsuccessful. So we want the money that goes into the deal to be consistent with the goals of the science and the project and the budget. So we're not in the business of underfunding, which clearly is not going to reach, you know, the objectives. And then it's always an emotive issue about risk and reward, like who's taking the risk and who's paying to discharge the risk, and then who deserves how much reward. There's obviously some buy-in required to work with an exciting company that spent some money already developing their technology. But there's also a tension between, if we're paying for the entire research funding, you know, how much of a reward, you know, should the company expect at the end of that, compared to companies that take a bit more of a risk themselves. And then we also want the financial incentives to make everyone do a great job. You know, if a company does really well and passes through some milestones, you know, they perhaps deserve to be rewarded. But we also, there's a few things like having lots of milestones close together when very little risk has changed. We probably question that. But in general, we want this set up for success and to reward good behaviors and, a win for both sides. But whether companies need money up front or later, do you want a little bit less today or more later? There's a whole load of considerations here in every deal that varies a lot company by company. And we also have analysed, all of the competing deals in that space and all of our internal deals to know again roughly what market looks like for X number of targets or this stage of project in, let's say, neuroscience. We know roughly what the general market sentiment is as well.
Thanks. So moving on then to some of the other provisions that you might see in these agreements. So exclusivity is one other key one, and it's for both parties really to obviously commit not to compete with this program, including the biotech. So it's a research program. I mean, that's less likely, but it's important on both sides. There's a commitment not to work on competing programs, and the provision in the agreement will normally set out, how long that kind of exclusivity will last, and how broad is it. So I mean that there are challenges, I guess, from a pharma company perspective in committing to exclusivities and non-compete provisions, and often there'll be a suggestion to make it restricted, for example, to the target and not necessarily the therapeutic area, because of course the pharma partner is likely to have any number of drug programs in a certain area or addressing a certain indication. And also pharma partners often have lots of affiliates and subsidiaries, and there may not be a huge kind of clarity exactly on or ability to be able to commit not to work in a certain area, given the number of different research programs that a large pharma will be working on. I've seen it before where there's more of a technology collaboration. So the research phase is kind of working on the biotech partners' technology platform with the hope of getting some targets out of that. And sometimes in those cases, there might be a mechanism in the agreement for kind of checking when a compound or target is reached in the research collaboration for the pharma partner to then do some form of internal kind of, I've heard it described as like a gatekeeping mechanism, so the pharma partner can check internally whether or not there might be any competing compounds. I suppose it's a little bit easier when you're licensing in kind of a compound already addressed to a target or an indication, then you kind of probably already know at the outset whether there might be an issue with kind of non-competing programs with that particular program. And usually in terms of just going back to the clause, so it needs to be carefully defined and limited in duration, and probably the shorter the better, in terms of just being able to enforce it. So it is less likely to be enforceable from a competition law perspective if it's a very long duration. So often it can be just for the research phase or a period of time after that. Normally the competition lawyers will probably have a look at it depending on the scale of the deal involved. Tim, is there anything you want to say else on that as well?
It's a nice summary. I mean, this is one where just check the definitions in your agreement about what exactly you're working on together. Other than that, it was a nice summary. But whether it's the target, a type of biology, a type of technology, a type of modality, it can be like chopped up in lots of different ways. So just be clear what you're wanting to work on together. Rachel's right. In very big companies, we wouldn't provide, in most areas, very broad exclusivity. It's even hard for us to know every little twist and turn that's going on in our company. And then there's sort of actively competing, and then there's, if you're screening a lot of compounds somewhere and a particular activity gets thrown up very weakly, that's not really active competition. And so we will just, a sensible approach through this is usually best.
So termination is another key aspect of these agreements and important to get right. And, so the contract should really ideally set out the specific scenarios where a party can terminate. Usually there won't be a termination at will, or otherwise known as by convenience or on notice. So that, where one party just decides they want to come out of the agreement just for their own reasons and just give notice to do that. I mean, they're quite rare to find in these types of agreements from the perspective of the biotech partner, because there would query the kind of rationale for why the biotech partner would want to be able to exit early. And the difficulty is from the pharma partner's perspective. So they may insist on being able to have one. For example, if there may be a point at which for some reason they can no longer work on the program, or there's some sort of reorganization or reprioritization, they may need to be able to give notice. So there's the reason from the pharma partner side, and then the biotech partner, well, they may, I suppose from their perspective, they've kind of invested in this relationship with the pharma partner, and probably unlikely to really need or want to have rights to terminate at will. But I think the pharma partner would not want the biotech to be able to do that based on the kind of investment that the pharma partner puts in, in terms of the research funding phase, and then the onward development. The pharma partner will need to have a kind of security in knowing that if the pharma partner carries on doing the development of the product, that it can do so, and unless any of the other reasons for terminations kick in, there won't be a risk that it kind of can lose the program and the agreement can be terminated. So the other bits there, so the common examples section is where you may see a right to terminate in these scenarios. So if there is a material breach, or there's a non-payment of payments, there's a breach of a specifically important term as well, and failure to meet minimum commercialization obligations. So I mean, the biotech partner will want to be able to terminate if they think that and this is the worst case scenario, because obviously we hope that these kind of provisions don't ever apply and that the collaboration goes really well. But if it doesn't, I suppose there needs to be some sort of mechanism if the biotech feels that the pharma partner isn't progressing the program or has not met some of its obligations, to be able to basically take the program back and license on to someone else. So that's kind of hopefully unlikely scenario, but from the pharma's perspective, they'll want to limit those scenarios where the biotech can terminate, again, as I mentioned before, because it will want to protect the investment that it's done to date. And there may well be a strong pushback on these from the pharma partner. I think the main commitment that it will give is in terms of actually progressing the program. So if it fails to progress the program, and I was going to come on to that shortly, then that might be a good reason for the research collaboration in the license phase to be able to be terminated. But as regards so I think a lot of these they will be negotiated, and I think there'll be quite a lot of discussion on that. And I'll come on to the minimum commercialization obligations, but quite often a pharma will want to try and again minimize the scenario where a biotech partner can terminate, even based on such a failure, if actually the pharma partner is still investing in the program and they're spending a certain amount of money, or they've met certain milestones within the last 12 months or something. They will see that as being, well, we're still carrying on with the program, and actually we are still investing in it. So we don't want to lose our rights to it under this type of provision. So those are kind of discussions that might be had there. I'm sort of conscious of time, so I'm just going to move on. But Tim, did you have any other things to say about those aspects?
No, the one thing that comes up is people worrying about accidental breach. So, if something happens, like something's a little bit later and it was out of your control, there's a dispute resolution process usually that comes before outright termination. So just make sure the flow of decision making appears sensible. But no, I think you covered it nicely.
Thanks. I won't go through all of these, but obviously it's very important that once, at whatever point the agreement is terminated, that there's absolute clarity on what happens in all these scenarios. And I think, the most important really is kind of IP rights and patents, particularly after the research collaboration phase. So, if the pharma partner has carried on developing and, putting more investment, what then happens if there is a termination because the pharma partner has potentially stalled or decided not to continue to develop the program? What happens to the IP then that the pharma partner has developed after the research collaboration phase? And quite often they'll, because of the kind of its own IP that the pharma partners put in at that point, it may be that, well, they can't, there's difficulty in granting those rights back to the biotech. So the biotech would, the license to the pharma would cease at termination point, but not necessarily the rights that the pharma has developed after that, after the collaboration phase. So there may need to be some sort of discussion around negotiating a license back, potentially of any future IP or compounds, etc., that the pharma has developed, if the biotech wants to gain access to that, to license it, to be able to take the program back in-house or to be able to license it onto a third party. And just some other aspects there about making sure, on termination, what happens to confidential information. But I'm conscious of time, so I don't know if I've got a few more slides. Aline, I don't know if it's worth.
Yeah, Rachel, just before moving on, there's a quick question from Cheryl, I think, back to Tim's comment about the practicals of oversight of timelines and deliverables. He's asking how much information about this oversight of timelines or deliverables should be included in the agreement. So that's something you should add, and how much information you should put in that.
I mean, from my perspective, there should always be clarity on, in terms of timelines of the research plan, ideally as much clarity in the research plan, which be attached to the back of the agreement, and actually what outcomes, what the desired outcomes and deliverables are from the research. Ideally, that should be set out in the research plan as well. I don't know, Tim, sorry, do you want to add anything to that?
Usually there's a joint steering committee that meet sort of a certain period of time, and their responsibilities are detailed around highlighting any changes to timelines and budget in relation to the agreed work plan, and then what to do about it. So yeah, we would expect complete joint oversight of how it's going and what to do about it if things go wrong. And often you see that in the some sort of formation of a joint steering committee, and we obviously want projects to work nicely, or we don't want sort of micromanaging on can someone order like 2 syringes on a Wednesday or something, but in terms of significant changes to what was agreed, yeah, there needs to be a debate, then reports produced, and then mitigation plans put in place, and just so that things roll in a successful way. But it is science, so the plan on day one, I'm sure, will need to evolve by agreement over time, and often those provisions on how to modify the agreement and what to do about any changes in overall costs are also included in the document. So just take a careful look at how all that's spelled out.
Okay, so I think we're kind of at the last phase bit, but I think there's some key bits that was worth covering, and then we'll skip over some bits if that's all right with everyone. So so these are kind of coming on more to the standard terms, which I think Tim alluded to earlier. So there are some aspects that absolutely have to go in. Tim mentioned in terms of payment terms, there'll be a certain internal policy that may mean, yes, that invoices are paid a certain time, 30 days, 60 days or something like that. Royalty reporting, so typically if there are royalties that are due under the agreement in the kind of license phase, it would be standard for the biotech to ask for regular royalty reports, and also ask for a right to audit the pharma partners books, but that's, I suppose that's usually done through an independent auditor, if agreed to by the pharma. Obviously that's important for there to be some sort of documentation. The biotech will want to have some sort of report from the pharma so that they know what kind of royalties they're owed. And one thing I know from the pharma perspective as well is that there'll always need to be provisions to allow pharma's affiliates to get involved. I mean, that will be right from the initial confidentiality agreement that's signed, that affiliates are covered. So, you know, the pharma partner will need to be able to delegate certain rights and obligations to different companies in the group, and ability to share confidential information with those specific companies, you know, for the purpose of the program. So not just with all affiliates, but with employees who need to know it for the purposes of performing the research phase or for the onward licensing phase. And, you know, it's entirely possible that, you know, during the research phase, there'll be scientists involved from the pharma side from different entities as part of that kind of group. So that's the kind of need to be able to cover affiliates. And, you know, there'll always be a kind of right as well to be able to assign to affiliates if needed, to assign the whole agreement to affiliates. And in fact, that's also important for the biotech partner as well, because, you know, the biotech may be seeking, well, at some point, I suppose it depends on the type of deal, but whether or not they might want to be able to assign to an affiliate that acquires them during the course of the deal. I suppose that may be an issue for the pharma partner if they have that right to assign without the need for consent. But these are certain provisions that are kind of typically included. I've just set out there some of the more legally complex provisions, which I won't go through in detail, but they do need to be negotiated and agreed, but typically more between the lawyers than the kind of business and research side. And then I think, I mean, IP enforcement, this kind of goes hand in hand with kind of the pharma partners' commitment to kind of take on the patent prosecution for the licensed patents. You know, it's very expensive. So obviously then the trade-off is that the pharma partner will want to be able to control then any need for enforcement of the patents against third parties. And, you know, the pharma partner will have the resources and expertise to be able to kind of deal with any potential claims, or, you know, bring claims against a third party if it's if there's a third party that may be infringing the licensed patents too. I'm just skipping quickly on because I don't want to miss out one particular slide. So I think, so Tim mentioned dispute resolution. This is one of the clauses at the end of the agreement, but it's actually important to be able to see, you know, how disputes that may arise can be resolved. And I think there should, I mean, as Tim mentioned, there's the joint project team, and there is a focus on that. I didn't set it out in detail in the slides, but obviously that needs to be clearly defined as to who takes part in that, and how disputes are, you know, how discussions are made, how decisions are made, whether or not that's kind of by unanimous vote or whether one party has a casting vote. And there's a lot of detail around, you know, who, when the meetings take place, who attends the meetings, and then how, you know, how the kind of minutes for the meetings are documented and that sort of thing. So that's all very important to include, and that's part and parcel, a key part of the collaboration phase as well. I will skip over those bits, but they are important aspects of any agreement. I just quickly wanted to, if we've got time, to just talk about this diligence, commercially reasonable endeavours piece. So So, I mean, this is finally, but by no means least, this is a key definition in collaborations where there's a license piece afterwards, and really kind of underpins the efforts that the pharma company is obliged to make in its onward development of the product. And it refers to the minimum standard of diligence to progress that's needed to progress the research program. And it's usually defined with respect to kind of the efforts and resources that would be undertaken by a company of a similar size in relation to a similar type of product. And it's usually drafted that the pharma partner or its affiliates or sub-licensees will use commercially reasonable endeavours to develop at least one licensed product through to commercial, kind of classic language. You know, typically the biotech partner will obviously want to have an understanding of what the pharma partner intends to do in terms of its onwards development. We'll want to see if it's, you know, what plans it has for each year, and we'll want to have the kind of scope for saying, well, if, you know, if the project stalled for any period of time, that, you know, that shouldn't happen, that the pharma partner kind of carries on. And, you know, if it does stall for any reason, that the biotech might want to have the right to terminate the agreement, because the biotech, you know, effectively they've licensed all their rights to that program, so they can no longer work on it. But then conversely, from the pharma partner's perspective, they may need to kind of push back on some of those things, you know, based on the fact that the product has then become part of their own portfolio and is subject to all their own internal processes. And it may be difficult for them to kind of commit to a kind of 12-month forward development plan, because it's not clear on how development will go or how quickly it will go. We may want freedom to kind of change course during the course of, you know, the next 12 months, say. So instead of a commitment for a timetable for development, a pharma partner may kind of say, well, obviously we report to you on kind of what we have been doing, but may find it more difficult to commit to future work. But then, you know, there's usually a discussion around, well, how long, if a pharma partner needs to suspend activities for a short period of time, is that okay? And if so, how long can that be? Biotech partner obviously won't want that to be very long at all. The pharma partner might say, well, it might be necessary for certain reasons that are beyond its control. And then just the reference to the safe harbors there, I've seen that, and sometimes that's a way of the pharma partner saying, look, if we do certain things, like we've spent a certain amount of money on this program, or we've hit certain milestones in any year, then, you know, we have been using our commercially reasonable efforts to kind of progress the program. So that's, you know, we've kind of ticked that box, and there shouldn't be a right to terminate because we're definitely progressing the program. We may not have, you know, we may not have got to a particular development milestone that maybe was discussed, but we're still progressing, and we're doing, you know, we're still fully committed to the program. So there shouldn't be any kind of reason for the biotech to kind of terminate at that point. But Tim, you've probably got a lot of experience with this. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think sensible obligations. We have a lot of agreements, so that very bespoke, onerous reporting doesn't go down that well with us, just because literally we've got hundreds of these things to satisfy. So just legally, it's hard for us to do it. But no, in general, you covered it nicely.
Okay, so thanks, Tim. We are at the kind of end point now, so conscious that we've gone over time, so do forgive me. I think just wanted to kind of draw some thoughts together and kind of go back to where we started in terms of the aims. And I think, you know, I think these have been covered, and Tim's talked about them a lot, so I won't kind of focus too much on that. I guess, yeah, Tim, unless there's anything else you wanted to draw together, and then I was just going to come on to post-agreement considerations after that.
No, I need to reiterate what we said at the start together, that we obviously want the reward, the risk reduction, you know, the IP, the work stress to be sort of all smoothly driving towards success for both parties. So there's a lot of things that need to come together. That's all.
Yeah, and I think it's ultimately, I think as we've discussed, both partners want the agreement to be fair so that both parties can kind of progress the program and get the most out of it. So that's ultimately where both parties want to get to. It's just the negotiation might take time to get there. But I mean, just to finish off then, and I think what happens next after the agreement has been finally signed. Perhaps breathe a sigh of relief, and then, as I've often heard said, you may just put the agreement in a drawer, and in fact that may be the best thing. Obviously there's certain aspects that you'll definitely want to know about in terms of commitments for the research phase, for how the joint project team functions, and other kind of key payment milestones. But as Tim said to me earlier, I mean, obviously, no, you don't really want to have to look at the agreement, because often you would be looking at it if something goes wrong. So the hope is that you remember the key points, and then hope that you don't need to look at it in great detail. But so just final bits there in terms of what happens after the contract's been signed. So obviously the research phase, obviously the full implementation of the joint project team, and following all the commitments that have been made in the research plan. But then once that phase is finished, I think some of the collaboration structure sort of falls away if the joint project team is only in place for the research phase. So it's useful to have a kind of single point of contact in each organisation. There'll be the backing of the rest of the team, but a single point of contact that can kind of help ensure the collaboration onwards kind of goes smoothly, and is the first port of call for any issues cropping up to be resolved. Obviously, it's ideal that happens at that phase rather than having to go down any formal dispute resolution route. And then, in terms of the agreement management, it's just important to keep up to date with what obligations kick in when, and also when payments are likely to be made, and that all goes to the reporting obligations, and just keeping an eye on those. And any other timing points. But again, I think this whole piece could be discussed at length, so I won't say any more about it unless, Tim, if you wanted to give any other final thoughts or anything.
No, I mean, usually there's a professional project manager for the collaboration named, and certainly in a big company we would have a professional alliance manager that would help set up the meetings. And but yeah, I mean, professional execution is important, as well as all the great science that's going on.
Great, thanks. So apologies, I'm slightly over time, but yes, that was it. But please, thanks very much for your time, everyone. And for those that are still here, please let Tim or I know if you have any other questions. I'm happy to answer those.
Yeah, I think we lost a few people on that towards the end of it. So maybe there's no burning question right now, and I can't see any. What I'll do is what I said in the chat box. It's just circulating the recording, and put your contact details, at least you, Rachel, for the technical part. So if anyone has a very specific question, they can get in touch with you. But I felt it was a really, really good summary and overview, and maybe leading the way for further discussion, more detail, either on the before that on due diligence, or after that on alliance management, and maybe to regather together and discuss that.
Yeah, of course, do say if there would be any other topics that would be useful.
Great. So I can't see the burning question in the chat box, so I think I'm going to release everyone. Thanks a lot for joining. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Tim. That was really good overview, and thanks, Tim. I liked bringing back the pharma perspective that that sometimes is slightly questioned, but just explaining the rationales of why you're doing that actually everyone is pursuing the exact same objective of delivering good science, and bringing great innovation to patients is also always nice to bring back on the table. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you at the next one.
Right. Have a nice day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.